I want you out of here by Friday. Do you understand me?
Get out.
You have no legal right to do this. This is unacceptable. We talked about this months ago. You can't just ignore the contract.
I understand your frustration, but you need to listen to me.
My landlord tried to evict my kids and me out of our apartment, certain a broke single father had no way to fight back, and 18 months later, I was the one signing the paperwork that made me his new landlord, and this is the full story of exactly how that happened, from the eviction notice taped to my door to the day he stood in my office asking for more time on his own rent. My name is Marcus, and after my divorce, I moved my 2 kids, Jaden and Amara, into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in an older building managed by a landlord named Harold, a man who owned several properties across the city and had built a reputation, one I didn't fully understand until much later, for treating tenants as inconvenient obstacles rather than people, and for the first year in that apartment, things were manageable, the rent was affordable on my coordinator's salary, the building was old but functional, and my kids had a stable place to call home after everything that had happened with their mother leaving. But slowly, over the following year, Harold began raising the rent in increments that felt deliberately aggressive, always just under the threshold that would require additional notice. And every time I asked about maintenance issues, a leaking pipe in the bathroom, a broken heater in the middle of winter, faulty wiring in Amara's bedroom that flickered the lights. Unpredictably, Harold's response was always the same dismissive tone, telling me to just deal with it, or that he'd get to it eventually, which usually meant it never got addressed at all unless I threatened to withhold rent, which I never actually did because I couldn't afford the risk of losing housing stability for my kids over a standoff I might lose, and I want to be honest about this part of my life, because it wasn't just financially difficult, it was exhausting in a way that wears down your sense of dignity, coming home from a full day of work to fix things myself that my landlord was legally responsible for, patching a leak with materials I bought myself because Harold wouldn't send anyone for weeks, all while raising 2 young kids essentially alone, and Harold, I came to learn, had a particular pattern with tenants he perceived as vulnerable, single parents, elderly renters, people without the resources or knowledge to push back legally. He would let maintenance slide, raise rent aggressively, and when tenants eventually fell behind or complained too loudly, he would move quickly toward eviction proceedings, banking on the fact that most people in difficult financial situations don't have the time, money, or legal knowledge to fight back effectively, and I became one of those tenants during a particularly hard stretch, about 2 years after my divorce, when my company went through a round of budget cuts and my hours, along with my pay, were temporarily reduced for nearly 4 months while I searched for something more stable, and during that stretch I fell behind on rent for the first time since moving in, only by about 6 weeks, but it was enough for Harold to act with a speed that genuinely surprised me. Within days of my second missed payment, an eviction notice appeared taped to my door, formal, cold, giving me 30 days to either pay the full balance or vacate the property, and I remember standing in that hallway, notice in hand, feeling a very specific, familiar kind of fear, not just about losing an apartment, but about what it would mean for Jaden and Amara to have to change schools again, to lose the small stability we had managed to rebuild after everything with their mother. And Harold, when I called him directly to explain the situation and ask for a short extension, was blunt in a way that told me exactly how he saw the situation. He said, "Marcus, I run a business, not a charity. If you can't pay, I need someone in that unit who can," and something about the casual dismissiveness in his voice, the assumption that I was simply another statistic he could remove without consequence, triggered something in me that I hadn't fully felt since the day my ex-wife walked out of our kitchen with her suitcases already packed. A very specific, focused kind of resolve, and I want to be clear that in that moment, I didn't have some grand plan to eventually buy Harold's building. That thought would have seemed absurd given my financial situation at the time. What I had instead was a much simpler, more immediate decision. I was not going to let this man remove my kids from their home without at least understanding exactly what my actual legal rights were, so instead of panicking, I spent that first night after receiving the notice doing something I probably should have done much earlier in our tenancy. I researched thoroughly tenant protection laws in our state, and what I found changed the entire trajectory of the situation, because it turned out Harold's eviction notice violated several specific procedural requirements. The notice hadn't properly accounted for a partial payment I had made during that period. It failed to include mandatory disclosure language required for eviction notices in our jurisdiction, and most significantly, I discovered documentation, through old maintenance request emails I had saved out of habit, showing a consistent pattern of unaddressed habitability issues that our state's tenant protection statutes specifically allowed as grounds for rent reduction or even rent withholding claims, meaning Harold's own negligence as a landlord had potentially undermined his legal standing to evict me over the reduced payments in the first place. and armed with this information, I contacted a tenant rights legal aid organization that offered free consultations for exactly these kinds of disputes. And the attorney I spoke with, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia, confirmed what I had started to suspect, that Harold's eviction attempt was not just aggressive but likely legally indefensible given his documented maintenance negligence, and she agreed to formally represent me in contesting the eviction. And I remember the specific moment everything shifted in this conflict. It was during the first mediation hearing, when Patricia calmly laid out, point by point, the maintenance complaint history alongside the technical deficiencies in Harold's eviction notice, and I watched Harold's confident, dismissive demeanor completely change as he realized, likely for the first time, that this particular tenant he assumed would simply fold under pressure had instead built a legitimate, well-documented case against him, and the eviction was dismissed, not just paused but formally dismissed, with the mediator additionally noting Harold's documented pattern of maintenance neglect as a serious concern requiring corrective action. And I want to be honest, that legal victory alone would have been enough of a story, successfully defending my family's home against an unfair eviction. But what happened over the following months is what actually changed my entire financial trajectory, because going through that legal process taught me something I hadn't fully understood before. It taught me how tenant protection law actually worked, how habitability standards were enforced, and more importantly, it exposed me directly to Patricia's broader work, because during our case she mentioned, almost in passing, that she was increasingly working with a small but growing coalition of tenant advocates and community investors who were beginning to purchase poorly managed rental properties specifically to convert them into fairly run, well-maintained buildings. And something about that idea lodged itself in my mind and didn't leave, because I understood, better than most people entering that conversation, exactly what made a building poorly managed, and exactly what tenants in situations like mine actually needed. So over the following year, while continuing to stabilize my own career, which had by this point led me into an operations management role with steadily increasing income, I began quietly educating myself about real estate investment, specifically the acquisition of undervalued or poorly managed rental properties, attending community workshops Patricia's network organized, learning about financing structures, property management fundamentals, and the specific legal and financial vulnerabilities that made properties like Harold's, and buildings like it across the city, actually available for strategic acquisition when their owners eventually faced enough accumulated legal and financial pressure from their own negligence. And here is where the story takes the turn that I still find remarkable when I look back on it, because it turned out Harold's eviction attempt against me was not an isolated incident, it was part of a much broader pattern, and within about a year of my case, several other tenants in his various properties, emboldened partly by hearing about how my case had gone, began filing their own habitability and unfair eviction complaints, and Harold, who had built his entire property management approach around cutting maintenance costs and aggressively pressuring vulnerable tenants, suddenly found himself facing a cumulative wave of legal and financial liability he had never adequately prepared for, mounting legal fees, mandatory repair orders issued by city housing inspectors following multiple tenant complaints, and a reputation among local tenant advocacy networks that made it increasingly difficult for him to operate without scrutiny. And it was during this period of mounting pressure on Harold's properties that I made the decision, with Patricia's guidance and eventually with a small group of like-minded local investors I had met through her network, to formally explore acquiring distressed rental properties in our area, specifically ones where poor management had created both tenant hardship and genuine financial vulnerability for the owners. And I want to be clear about the timeline here because it matters. This wasn't a quick, dramatic turn of events. It was nearly 18 months of careful, deliberate work, building enough financial stability in my own career, learning the actual mechanics of property acquisition, and building relationships with the small investment group I would eventually formalize a partnership with. And it was through this process that Harold's specific building, the one my kids and I still lived in, came up as a genuine acquisition opportunity, because Harold, facing mounting legal costs from multiple tenant disputes and required city-mandated repairs he had spent years avoiding, made the decision to sell that particular property rather than continue absorbing what had become an increasingly expensive liability. And when the opportunity came through Patricia's network to formally bid on the acquisition, I made the decision, alongside my investment partners, to pursue it directly, not out of some dramatic desire for personal vindication, though I won't pretend that thought never crossed my mind, but because I understood, better than almost anyone bidding on that property, exactly what needed to change inside that building, and exactly what the tenants living there, people in situations very similar to mine, actually deserved from ownership. And the acquisition process itself took several months, standard financing arrangements, inspection reports that confirmed years of deferred maintenance exactly as I expected, and eventually the closing meeting where the building's ownership formally transferred, and I remember the specific moment I signed those documents, sitting in a conference room with Patricia and my investment partners, feeling not triumph exactly, but a very particular, grounded sense of responsibility, because I understood that becoming the owner of that building meant becoming responsible for people currently living in circumstances I understood intimately, and within the first month of ownership, our small partnership group implemented the changes that mattered most: immediate repair of the maintenance issues that had gone unaddressed for years, transparent, predictable rent structures instead of the aggressive incremental increases Harold had relied on, and a genuine responsive maintenance system that actually addressed tenant concerns instead of dismissing them. And I want to describe the specific moment that closed the loop on this entire story, because it happened almost exactly 2 years after that eviction. Notice had first appeared taped to my apartment door, when Harold, who by this point had sold off several of his remaining properties after his reputation and finances had continued deteriorating following the wave of tenant complaints his negligence had triggered, reached out through a mutual industry contact asking to meet, and I agreed, mostly out of the same quiet curiosity that had defined other unexpected reunions in my life. And when we met in a small coffee shop rather than any dramatic office setting, Harold looked noticeably different than the confident, dismissive landlord who had once told me he ran a business, not a charity. He looked tired, smaller somehow, and he explained with a kind of resigned honesty I hadn't expected, that he was struggling to manage his remaining properties given his damaged reputation and mounting legal costs, and he asked carefully whether my partnership group would be interested in acquiring one of his last remaining buildings, and whether I might personally be willing to put in a good word given our history, and I sat with that request for a long moment, looking at this man who had once tried to remove my children and me from our home without a second thought, assuming I had neither the resources nor the knowledge to resist, and I told him, honestly, that I would review the property on its own financial merits the same way I reviewed any acquisition opportunity, nothing more, nothing personal, and I meant that, because somewhere over those 2 years, this had genuinely stopped being about Harold specifically. It had become about something much larger, about understanding exactly how vulnerable tenants get taken advantage of, and using that understanding to build something that actually protected people in situations I once lived through myself. And if there's a lesson in this story, it isn't really about outsmarting a landlord who underestimated me, though that part certainly happened. It's about what happens when you refuse to let someone else's assumption about your limitations become the final word on your situation. Harold assumed a struggling single father had no resources to fight back, no knowledge of his rights, no path forward beyond simply accepting whatever terms he decided to impose, and instead, that exact struggle became the education that eventually let me build something that didn't just protect my own family, it changed how an entire building, and eventually several buildings, treated the people living inside them. And sometimes, the most complete kind of justice isn't about revenge against the specific person who wronged you, it's about becoming the exact opposite of what they represented, using what you learned surviving their negligence to make sure fewer people ever have to survive it again.